You know, when you watch one of those glass ant farms,
Oh, yeah. They're, they're mesmerizing.
they really are. There's this initial expectation of like perfect harmonious order, right?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
see all those little insects moving dirt, um, building these intricate tunnels, feeding the queen. It looks like a finely tuned engine.
Right, like a beautiful, peaceful utopia of biological cooperation.
Exactly. Every single unit has a dedicated purpose.
Hmm.
But when you lean in and actually look past that surface level order, the reality of what you're observing shifts into something much, much darker.
It really does, because the synchronicity is what draws the eye, right?
Right.
We naturally gravitate towards systems that appear highly organized.
Right.
It gives this illusion that everything is part of a grander, deliberate design.
But then you realize you aren't looking at a society of individuals cooperating at all. You are looking at a single, mindless organism.
Yeah. The concept of the individual doesn't even exist.
No, it's been completely erased in favor of a biological machine.
It's wild.
It is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack a highly provocative, sweeping, and honestly unconventional view of human history.
Very ungamish.
Yeah. It's presented in a collection of writings from a group known as the Valorian Society. We are exploring their foundational texts, which include titles like Human History, Word-Controlled Humans, and Camp 38.
And these sources take that terrifying concept of the mindless ant farm and they just map it directly onto human civilization.
They really do. They divide the entirety of human history into this mortal, eternal conflict between two diametrically opposed cultures. On one side, you have sovereign individuals, and on the other, manipulated masses.
And these texts, I mean, they do not hold back. They take direct aim at the foundations of modern religion, biological evolution, and global political structures.
Right. And just so we are perfectly clear with you, the listener, as we dive into this, our job today is not to endorse, validate, or debunk these highly controversial viewpoints.
Right, absolutely not.
We are strictly here to impartially map the intellectual architecture of this original text, just so you can understand the mechanics of this unique worldview. We are explorers in this conceptual territory, not advocates.
Exactly. We're just laying out what they argue.
And it is a wild territory to explore. By the time we finish this deep dive, this source material is going to challenge you to completely reframe, well, the pyramids of Egypt, the historical purpose of Jesus of Nazareth, and even the fundamental nature of the fiat currency sitting in your bank account right now.
Yeah, it's a massive paradigm shift.
But to understand this massive reframing, the text argues that starting with recorded human history is actually starting far too late.
Way too late.
Yeah, we have to rewind the clock roughly 3 billion years to examine the fundamental mechanics of biological evolution.
Right, because for the vast majority of our planet's history, evolution was just a strictly mechanical process.
Cellular division and a brutal, unthinking game of, chemical consumption. Eat or be eaten.
Exactly. But then, around 600 million years ago, the text points to this massive disruptive evolutionary leap, which is the emergence of sex.
And what's fascinating here is how the text redefines the biological purpose of that leap. Because we traditionally view sex strictly through the lens of, genetic recombination and reproduction, right?
Right. But the Valorian Society argues that sex was actually an evolutionary leap in consciousness.
Wow.
Yeah. For the very first time in biological history, species survival mandated the development of perception.
Perception.
Yes. It required a living entity to possess the actual neurological and chemical hardware to recognize, value, and cherish another discrete entity outside of itself.
Without simply consuming it or destroying it.
Exactly. Sex, in this framework, was literally the birth of individual perception.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if perception and individual recognition were the pinnacle of this evolutionary leap, how does the text explain the existence of highly evolved yet totally mindless social insects?
Right, the ants and the bees.
Yeah. The text points to ants, termites, and bees as this massive biological cautionary tale. It argues that they didn't evolve. They actually regressed.
That's the core of it. They took this incredible evolutionary hardware of perception, completely stripped it away from the individual, and reverted to a hive mind, what the text specifically terms a group entity.
So it's like humanity getting assimilated by the Borg in sci-fi, trading individual perception for a mindless hive.
That's a perfect analogy, yeah. The mechanism of that regression is the focal point. The text argues that these insects surrendered their individual sovereignty to the collective.
So the individual ants or bees function merely as mindless, disposable cells within a larger macro body.
Exactly. And they are managed and controlled entirely by chemical odors. Pheromones dictate their every action, just completely overriding any individual perception.
In the eyes of the Valorian Society, this was a catastrophic reversion back to the unthinking asexual stage of evolution.
Right. It's like instead of a physical parasite, their biology installed a malicious operating system that just overwrote the individual user entirely.
But wait, if insects use odors to control the hive, according to this text, what is the equivalent control mechanism for humans? I mean, what is the chemical odor humans are using to regress into a hive mind?
What's fascinating here is that the text argues the human equivalent of the chemical pheromone is the word.
The word, like language.
Yes, language, specifically when it is weaponized and combined with force, is the ultimate control mechanism.
Oh, wow.
The argument outlines how words are deployed to systematically override an individual's innate sensory perception.
From childhood, right?
Exactly. From childhood, humans are linguistically conditioned to accept authoritative words and concepts over what their own eyes and ears actually tell them.
So they are trained to abandon direct perceptive reality and instead plug into a conceptual reality dictated by whoever controls the narrative.
That's exactly it.
And when you look at the dawn of early civilization, the transition from scattered tribes to massive empires, the text details exactly how this linguistic and physical override was engineered.
Right.
And it claims it happened through two distinct methodologies, the Oriental model and the Western model.
Right. So let's start with the Oriental model.
Right.
It was brutal and very straightforward. It operated on undeniable physical mathematics.
Which is just that a coordinated mob is physically stronger than a single isolated individual.
Exactly. In the East, the culture formalized this into absolute law. They enforce extreme obedience to elders and rigid group hierarchies.
And the text argues this wasn't just sociological, right? It was actually a biological culling.
Yes, very much so. If an individual possessed strong, innate perception and refused to conform, they were systematically killed or exiled.
Wow.
Yeah, over generations, the nonconformists were literally bred out of the population, leaving just a genetically and psychologically compliant mass.
But according to the sources, the mass manipulators in the West developed a significantly more insidious mechanism. They didn't just rely on physical force or family hierarchy.
No, they got creative. They invented the concept of intangible, invisible authorities.
They manufactured gods.
Exactly. The genius of this Western model, according to the text, is that you cannot physically fight an invisible authority.
Right.
These mass manipulators appointed themselves as the exclusive spokespeople for these deities, issuing authoritative words that were deemed unquestionable.
Because when you convince an individual that the creator of the universe demands their absolute submission, you don't even need a sword to control them. They police their own minds.
It's the ultimate hack. And what is particularly provocative is the text's assertion that this exact same Western mechanism of the invisible, unquestionable authority is still highly active today.
Right. The text argues the intangible God has simply been rebranded as the consensus of scientific opinion.
Yes. A conceptual monolith used to immediately crush dissenting individual thought without needing to prove the underlying reality.
Now, when you look at the architectural footprint of early Western civilizations, specifically the Sumerians and the Egyptians, they poured an incomprehensible amount of resources into building massive structures. I mean, we generally view the Sumerian ziggurats or the Great Pyramids as these magnificent triumphs of early engineering and culture. Why does the text focus so much on them? Weren't those just architectural triumphs?
Not according to the Valorian Society. They view those monuments strictly as weapons of psychological warfare.
Psychological weapons?
Yeah. The architecture was designed to shrink the individual ego. The Sumerians used mass-produced food, the carrot, and group labor, the stick, to build a man-made mountain to the sky.
And the sheer staggering scale of these monuments was engineered to induce awe and terror in dissenting individuals.
Exactly. It was a permanent physical demonstration that the group was overwhelmingly, unfathomably more powerful than any single sovereign person.
It's like architectural gaslighting.
That's a great way to put it. It was designed to prove the absolute futility of individualism.
But if you have these massive pyramid-building group entities expanding their borders and dominating the physical landscape, you would assume assimilation was total and complete, right?
Do you think so?
But the text claims there was a dedicated resistance, an active biological and cultural pushback known as the culture of sovereign individuals.
Right. The sources locate this culture primarily in Northern Europe and Western Asia.
Peoples historically labeled as Hittites, Aryans, or Vikings.
Yes, and the text notes that the mass manipulators of antiquity often derisively dismiss them as uncultured barbarians.
Right, but the Valorian Society's interpretation completely inverts that narrative.
It does. It describes a highly sophisticated people who lived in rigorous harmony with perceptive nature. They fundamentally rejected the concept of man-made invisible gods, and they structured their entire society to actively prevent the formation of group entities.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because
Right.
you can't just wish away a group entity. You have to engineer a society that actively dismantles it. And their primary tool for this was socially approved, one-to-one mortal combat.
It sounds extreme, but it was a structural safeguard against tyranny.
If a would-be tyrant tried to form a mob, anyone could challenge him to a duel.
Exactly. It's like an ultimate anti-bullying policy. By ensuring every dispute was handled strictly one-on-one, they mathematically prevented anyone from hiding behind a mob.
You strip away the legal, social, or physical shield of the group and force the architect of the manipulation to assume total, individual, mortal risk for their actions.
Right. You cannot build a manipulative, aggressive mob if the leader is guaranteed to bleed for it.
And they applied this same intense focus on innate perception to their mating practices, didn't they?
They did. In the manipulated group entities of the East and West, mating was dictated by the hierarchy. Women were assigned mates based on social status, wealth, or proximity to the invisible authority.
But in stark contrast, the culture of sovereign individuals demanded that women have complete freedom to choose the father of their children based entirely on innate perceptive qualities.
Yes, they meted for courage, integrity, and physical vitality, deliberately propagating the genetics of sovereign perception rather than the genetics of social compliance.
I have to ask, though, mathematically, how does a localized philosophy like this survive? I mean, how did this philosophy survive when faced with the massive, organized armies of the group entities?
Well, the text explains that because they valued individual integrity and true voluntary comradeship above all else, when they were forced into conflict, they were unparalleled warriors.
They fought as free individuals deeply loyal to one another, not conscripted slaves.
Exactly. However, the text points out their fatal tragic flaw.
Which was?
Because their entire cultural software forbade permanent group entities and the use of deceit, they lacked the conceptual framework to recognize infiltration. They could easily defeat a standing army in an open field, but they were highly vulnerable to infiltrators who used lies, subversion, and trickery instead of swords.
Right. Because the sovereign individuals couldn't be beaten in a fair fight, the text claims the group entities had to pivot entirely to deceit and the twisting of words to destroy them.
Exactly.
And to illustrate this exact cultural war, the sources offer a radical reinterpretation of biblical history.
Yes, the Valorian Society's reading of biblical figures strips away the theology and analyzes them purely as political and cultural architects.
Take Moses, for example. The text completely discards the view of Moses as a holy savior liberating his people.
Right. Instead, it frames him as a classic mass manipulator who used extreme force and authoritative words to forge a new group entity in the isolation of the desert.
The text specifically highlights the events in the book of Exodus, where Moses orders the Levites to slaughter 3,000 of their own neighbors, friends, and brothers who dissented against his rules.
It views this not as divine justice, but as the brutal systemic culling required to force a hive mind into existence.
Wow. But then the text turns to Jesus of Nazareth, and the interpretation flips entirely. It presents Jesus as a true sovereign individual.
Yes. The text argues that Jesus' concept of the Father has been entirely misunderstood. He wasn't referring to an external, invisible dictator in the sky.
He was referring to an aboriginal creative consciousness, this innate, perceptive, biological spark of life that exists inherently within every living entity.
Yes, even in sparrows and lilies. According to this framework, Jesus deliberately invited his highly public crucifixion.
Right, not as a mystical blood sacrifice to appease an angry God, but as a profound, undeniable demonstration.
Exactly. He did it to publicly expose the eternal, mortal conflict between a sovereign individual acting on perception and the brutal, unthinking mechanics of the group entities of his era, specifically the Roman and Jewish political structures.
So he was exposing the machinery of the hive mind by forcing it to act out its brutality in the light of day.
Yes.
But if his foundational message was absolute internal individual sovereignty, how did that message birth the highly structured hierarchical religion we see today?
Well, the text places the blame entirely on Saul of Tarsus, known historically as the Apostle Paul. The argument makes the explosive claim that Paul used weaponized words to fundamentally nail Jesus back on the cross.
Wow.
The text asserts that Paul deliberately twisted Jesus' radical message of inner sovereignty into a group entity religion, falsely claiming Jesus was a literal blood sacrifice to a tribal invisible God.
Shifting the control away from the individual's inner perception and back to an external priesthood.
Precisely.
But I have to push back here. If the Northern Europeans were so perceptive, how did they ever fall for this twisted version of the story? I mean, how do you trick a society of sovereign warriors into submitting to an invisible authority?
It wasn't an overnight conquest. It was a methodical, generational process of subversion. The text explains that Roman priests infiltrated Northern Europe by initially telling the true story of Jesus.
The true story.
Yeah. They introduced Jesus as a courageous, weaponless, sovereign hero fighting the dragon, which in Northern mythology perfectly mapped onto the concept of the devouring group entity.
Oh, wow. So they used this honest narrative to gain their trust.
Exactly. Only after the priests gained deep trust did they slowly, over generations, begin to swap out the narrative software.
They deployed Paul's twisted, authoritative version of the story.
Yes, using it to systematically brainwash the youth. By shifting the theology from inner strength to external submission, they eventually turned the sovereign individuals against one another in holy wars, basically hollowing out their culture from the inside.
That is wild. And with the spiritual and cultural resistance of the ancient world fractured like that, the control grid shifted toward the modern era. The text argues the mass manipulators finalized their dominance using their most sophisticated, abstract tools, yet money and modern media.
Right. Because money, in this framework, is vastly more insidious than a simple medium of exchange.
The Valorian Society argues that money originating in Sumer is fundamentally packaged force.
Yes, it's a way to extract taxes and submission without overt violence. They don't need to send an armed soldier to your door. By controlling the only acceptable medium for your survival, they demand your compliance seamlessly.
When you accept coins or paper backed by a central bank, you are physically acknowledging your submission to that group entity's rules.
Exactly.
And the text brings this concept right to the doorstep of modern American history. It frames the original drafting of the U.S. Constitution as a valiant, brilliant, modern attempt to restore sovereign individualism.
But the text claims that this constitutional protection was fatally destroyed by what it calls a cloakroom conspiracy on December 23, 1913.
A passage of the Federal Reserve Act.
Yes. According to the sources, this unconstitutionally surrendered the nation's absolute power over its own money to a consortium of anonymous, non-elected international bankers.
Handing the steering wheel over to a hidden, globalized group entity.
Exactly.
And then this undercover government cemented its power through the FCC, creating unconstitutional licensing for radio and television.
Right. Ensuring only red herrings and inconsequential pap reach the public, effectively blinding them to reality.
So, what does this all mean? The text treats money and media like an invisible remote control collar. You think you're walking freely in the park, but the boundaries are strictly programmed into your mind.
It's a chilling thought.
It is. But if the Valorian Society thinks we are living in a planetary prison camp, what is their proposed solution?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Valorian Society advocates for what they term a dress rehearsal of individual sovereignty.
A dress rehearsal.
Yeah. They suggest perceptive individuals must actively, voluntarily separate themselves from the media-driven mass culture.
Refuse to be manipulated.
Exactly. Refuse to allow their perception to be overridden by words, and instead form small, voluntary groups based entirely on the ancient Northern European agreements of absolute individual sovereignty and innate perception.
We have covered a massive amount of intellectual ground today. We started by examining the evolutionary purpose of sex 3 billion years ago, reinterpreted the Egyptian pyramids as weapons of psychological awe, unpacked this radical reading of biblical figures, and finally traced the mechanisms of control all the way to the Federal Reserve and modern media as tools of an invisible, world-dominating hive mind.
It really is a breathtakingly comprehensive alternate lens through which to view human civilization.
It is. And whether you're prepping for a meeting, reading the news, or just living your daily life, this text challenges you to look at the structures around you. Are you making choices based on your own innate perception, or are you acting as a cell in a group entity whose rules were written by someone else?
It definitely forces you to critically examine the source of your own thoughts.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over, building off the source material. The text notes that we find the idea of ants and termites mindlessly serving a queen repulsive. But think about your own daily routine, your notifications, the algorithms feeding you information, and the societal ladders you climb. Look at the rapid rise of artificial intelligence. We are literally training algorithms to perceive the world for us.
We really are.
If a highly advanced alien species were observing our modern, globalized human society through a microscope, would they see a thriving community of sovereign individuals, or would they just see a highly complex anthill? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.